relying on prisons as their only source of jobs. Community leaders who focus on political empowerment, housing development, community development, but must understand that criminal justice issues are part and parcel of that agenda. And I want to take a moment to invite you to one of the initial efforts that's being undertaken in Syracuse, and that is on Thursday, the 28th of April. That's this Thursday at 5:30 at Southwest Community Center. We're having a first of our series of forums on racial justice in Syracuse, and the first one, in fact, is going to be on the criminal justice system. Finally, the third piece of the solution is reframing the criminal justice system. And this is very challenging because, as Angela Davis has pointed out, we have really come to accept prisons as an essential social institution. Even for an anti-prison activist such as myself, it's hard for me to think about abolishing prisons. When I first started this work in 1971, around the Attica prison cases, there were 12,000 people in the state of New York in prison, and we thought that was a lot. The peak a couple of years ago was 72,000, and now it's down to about 68, and we think we're making progress. It becomes very difficult to think about alternative ways of thinking about justice when we're so engaged in the day-to-day struggles. And we have individual victories on the cases of the folks that we try to keep out of prison or help them get out on parole, or even do some modest reform, like what's gone on in New York State with the Rockefeller drug laws. And because the struggle is so hard, we sometimes forget that that is a pale shadow of what we are really looking for. And we also fail to be attentive to how some of these so-called reforms get co-opted. And a really good example of that is drug courts, which emphasize treatment over incarceration. But what has happened in the proliferation of drug courts is that for the most part they're being used now for the most minor offenders, therefore they're not an alternative to incarceration. And they've also deflected energy from organizing around the decriminalization of drugs. So we have to keep a real close eye on how easy it is for the criminal justice system, key stakeholders, law enforcement and most of our political leaders, to co-opt even the more minor or lesser reforms. Those even get co-opted. I'm going to conclude by listing 4 things that we can do to reframe our criminal justice system. The first is we have to get serious about decriminalization of certain crimes, particularly drug crimes, as well as prostitution. We have to really demand that other social systems, other institutions, deal with those kinds of behaviors. The second is we have to reframe the goals and purposes of sentencing. We think that a just justice system would be built on a notion of reintegrative sentencing that would put alternatives to incarceration as the sentence of choice. In order to do this, we have to eliminate mandatory sentencing. We need to redefine the ideological underpinning of the criminal justice system from punishment to accountability. We have to look to what can best achieve accountability and safety, and not just what we can do to get revenge and exact our pound of flesh. To the extent that prisons will be among us, we have to have a campaign to reduce the length of sentence and improve conditions of confinement. To the extent that there may be reasons to isolate someone from mainstream society, this should be done judiciously, that is, infrequently, after all other proposals have been considered. and people who are removed from society must be treated humanely. The deprivation of liberty itself is the punishment. It does not have to be and should not be extended to conditions of confinement. We need to build real efforts at habilitation into any term of removal from society, real job training, real reentry planning, real support for people when they get released. Reintegrative sentencing doesn't wait for 20 years of a sentence. We have to shorten the sentence and make it possible for people to return to communities sooner rather than later. And last, but certainly not least, we cannot have a different system of justice in this country unless we end racism, racial disparity that is chronic in the criminal justice system. We have to tackle the racism at every stage of the system head on. Despite data that shows racial disparity at every stage of the system, professional journals are filled with arcane studies trying to show why, in fact, this disparity is due to something other than racism, and they can't do it. As this is the place to talk about solutions, I won't open the door to some of the things that Alan said about the role of prisons as the means of taking care of surplus labor, or as a sociologist, Lacroix has put it, an instrument for the management of the dispossessed, or as a means of economic development for poor, rural, and largely white communities. In order to create a solution to the criminal justice system as we know it, we have to form alliances with communities that are directly affected. We have to envision different responses to social and individual problems. We have to demand a redirection of the money that we now spend on prisons into education and other positive, productive, development-focused services. And we have to demand an end to the racism that is chronic in the system. And I hope that you, who are from Syracuse, will join us on Thursday night and begin to take this campaign to the community. Thank you very much.